welcome to Varn Blog, and I'm here with Danny Bessner, one of the hosts of the American Prestige podcast with Derick Davison. And what else are you doing today, Daniel?
I think I told you off mic, I was checking footnotes. So I'm emergent from the footnote mines, but it's a pleasure to see you, Varn. Pleasure to be back on the pod.
Yeah. Today we are talking about where the left, and for those of you who are listening, I am putting that in quotation marks because I no longer know what the fuck that means, is in regards to foreign policy. And what we make of the foreign policy turn of, let's say, leftist media, because that's a lot more of a meaningful statement right now. What do you make of the foreign policy turn there in the last year and a half of the Biden administration, of a lot of leftist commentariat, particularly in regards to Palestine?
So maybe you could identify specifically what you're talking about, and
Okay.
then I could comment on it.
That's fair. So what do you make about, let's say we'll pick on someone that you know, like Chapo Trap House, focusing a lot on Palestine, are the non-commitment movement advocated by some media advocates and, you know, around the Democratic Party in the run-up to the Biden election, and this focus on national politics amongst, let's say, leftist influencers and media figures.
I mean, I think it's good. Palestine has traditionally been part of the American left's interests for a variety of contingent reasons related to the emergence of a type of third worldism in the 1960s and 1970s, decolonization, and then, of course, the fact that the United States in the past 30, 40 years has significantly funded Israel. So it makes sense. It's been a traditional left-wing focus, and it remains so today. The uncommitted movement, obviously, didn't affect the outcome of the election per se, but it demonstrated that people will, specifically organized ethnic communities in particular regions of the country will, as a mass, effectively say no to the Democratic Party. The degree to which that matters in terms of actual politics is going to remain to be seen, given, how Michigan develops over the next few years. Maybe the Democrats don't care about it because it's just out of the Democratic world to be decided. Maybe they do care because it is. So, that's my general take on all of that.
Do you see any way for people who are arguing for the campus protests to have more effect than they seem to have had? Do you see, was there a way forward there, or was that a misrecognition?
No, not given the state of the American state or how power works in this country. But I still think it's admirable and meaningful that students protested, that they sort of noted their discontent with the Biden administration's foreign policy, but obviously that wasn't a path to changing the Biden administration's foreign policy. Is anyone arguing different? Maybe I haven't really heard, but that would seem to be in the realm of fantasy as opposed to reality if someone expected otherwise.
Well, it does seem to be that some people thought that could have had some effect by divestment, and I don't really know.
Why do they think that? Like, what is the causal chain? Nothing about the actual university suggests that to be the case. So I would ask what would make them think that, just from an analytical stance, not a normatively, yes, but analytically, obviously, that wasn't going to happen.
Right. I didn't see. I saw the negative response by the universities as being more about demands for opening the books and even what the students were saying. But that was my reading. I tend to think that the Israeli donors to university endowments are actually much smaller proportion of their income than people seem to think.
I don't think it's necessarily the Israeli donors. It's just like the status quo position of the United States. Which probably will change over time, because I think younger people do disagree, but that will be just a function of literally people dying and other people coming into maturity. I think it will change. But that to me is the mechanism of change, as opposed to student protests or divesting or whatnot. It's just going to be like people are going to react differently because they're going to have different historical associations with Israel than people who are over 50. And that is going to change things. And I think that's Israeli leaders don't give a shit about that, which is like pretty short-term strategic thinking. But I guess that's just reflective of the age.
So one of the things I wanted to ask about this. Do you see this as staying primarily a left-wing issue?
Do I see what specifically?
The Palestine Israel situation is staying primarily a left-wing issue, i.e., any support for um, um,
I
Palestinians.
don't think it's really. I don't think it's really left. I think it's people who are interested in foreign policy. I think if you're interested in foreign policy, you are interested in the Israel-Palestine issue. Like all the think tanks, all those people who are not left-wing are talking about it as well. And that seems to me to be more important. I mean, there's a significant constituency of the left that doesn't think it is important because they're focused much more specifically on domestic. I think it's more a foreign policy issue than a left-wing one, ultimately. And so I think a lot of upcoming foreign policy professionals do not feel that warmly toward Israel. And I think that is going to eventually be reflected in U.S. foreign policy in the next decades or so.
Why do you think that there's been a kind of younger consensus turn against
You could see
Israel?
it. You could see it. I mean, like what's happening in Gaza is just undeniable, and I think that's had an effect on people. Is naturally it would. Also, Israel's just a lot more, on the ground powerful in the 2020s than it was in the 1960s or 1970s, when a lot of these people came of political age, and so like and life for Palestinians is much degraded in those past decades. So I mean, the situation on the ground has changed. So it's not surprising that people who only know a world of that situation are going to have a different foreign policy.
So, do we think that one of the theories I was floating about why Biden was so tone deaf even to dissenting voices within the younger elements of the policy establishment was that there was a chance that Netanyahu just wouldn't listen if he tried to pull a Reagan in '83 or something like that.
Well, he'd have to listen if they did it for real because they would just stop the weapons. The problem is they wouldn't do that. The
Right.
American president has the power to be like, fuck you, we're not giving you any weapons. And by the way, we're not vetoing all the Security Council resolutions. Good luck. And if they followed through on that, Netanyahu would change in about 5 seconds. But no president is willing to do that for a variety of reasons. Biden, I think personally and ideologically, he's so old that he remembers like an age when international Jewry was actually in existential danger. But that is not the case any longer. And I think that people coming of age are going to have just very different policies.
All right. To also be specific, there's a lot of talk about Trump's quasi saber rattling about Panama and Greenland. In not so much leftist circles, but in liberal circles. How seriously should we take that?
I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that the United States had tried to purchase Greenland in the 19th century at some point. And he said Panama too, right? And there were discussions around that as well. So maybe it's just a return to form. It's nonsense. I can't imagine. I mean, I don't pay attention to this shit, but I imagine, Varn, tell me this, there must be less juice and shit like that. Like people, I mean, like I feel like in 2017 that would have been like there would have been histrionic responses to it, but at this point, people must be numb to that, right? For the most part.
I only see it on Bluesky, which I take as like the liberal form of Truth Social. So,
yeah, it's like an insane asylum, though, right? Or at least the states are running the asylum over there, right? It seems
right,
like close
to yeah. It's blue MAGA country, so
so there's some true believers still who are getting their heart rate up over Trump's claim he wants to buy Greenland. Yeah, that's so wild to me. God bless him.
However, it does seem like in general those talking points don't go out of it, not even to general Democrats, and much less to the broader population in the same way.
Yeah, because who could possibly give a shit about that? I'm amazed that anyone like still is able to. I'm impressed that anyone is still able to, but that's obviously so stupid,
So we're in a particular moment where there seems to be some interesting things that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about. One of which is Putin's response to Trump's talk on nuclear armament, which why don't you think we've heard more about that? Is that really not that big a deal? Is it just international posturing? What do we make of that?
I think just because it's in the general realm of once the United States decided to fund Ukraine, I mean, going back a decade at this point, support Ukraine, it was playing with the nuclear power. So I think it's, it's kind of in the realm of that, and it doesn't indicate a serious escalation. So I don't think, it's gotten that much play for that
So
reason, basically.
it's more just the what we might call the shadow dance of nuclear powers, kind of
Yeah,
quasi
I think so.
escalating, like.
Yeah, I think that yeah, it's not a genuine enough escalation, I guess, to get much play. I mean, it's kind of like a boring moment in international politics a little bit. Like there's not really that much going on. We're kind of on rails in Israel and Ukraine. I mean, it is important and it does matter to people, but it just seems like this is kind of an inertial moment that there's not going to be many changes. I mean, so Biden's foreign policy was pretty much Trump's foreign policy, and I imagine Trump's foreign policy is going to be relatively similar. I don't think there's going to be a huge onshoring of manufacturing jobs. I think it's going to be mostly more of the same. At least that's how I read this moment.
I don't even know how we would onshore massive manufacturing jobs when you're also trying to limit immigration.
No, it doesn't make sense. I mean, like it always doesn't make sense, and I think like everyone is kind of in a moment that's very past looking and very status quo, and because it just in a genuine way does feel like the future has been foreclosed. I don't know if things would have felt different with Kamala. At least she was significantly younger, but the fact that you have these octogenarians, I know Trump is 78, 79, is he 80 yet? It's just like, it just seems like, ugh, what are we even going to fight about?
Yeah, I mean, he is older than when Biden was elected to the same position, but
Right.
yeah, it does seem very uh very status quo, and it also seems like what's going to define at least the next 2 years is that being in power means factions in the right are actually going to have to fight with each other more because now they actually have stakes, right?
Yeah, but like, what are they really fighting over? I mean, there's not going to be. I mean, the National Conservatives are such, honestly, fools. The fact that they would fall for any of this bullshit. What do they expect? It's just going to be more giving money to the elite plutocratic class. Did they expect a form of national socialism? Because they weren't going to get it. So what is even fighting? This whole H-1B thing. It's like, yeah, it took Trump 2 seconds to align with capital, over anything else. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of like funny that they had any other illusions, but I guess people need to look forward to a future.
I find it quite interesting that Biden was even not Biden. Bannon was even resuscitated because I mean his faction clearly lost in the first Trump administration, and somehow they
Yeah,
show back up, and they've already lost now.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
um,
I think
uh,
that's the case, basically. So I don't think there's a future for national conservatism in a real way. It'll be fun to see JD Vance kind of just do whatever it takes to stay in power. He claims to be like a national conservative, right? Something like that. But I don't think it's really gonna work out for him on that front.
JD Vance and people like Arun McIntyre who might quote Nick Land and Pareto's elite school now, but were just standard neoconservatives as little as 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, is it's hard for me to take them as super principled
No,
people,
there's the
but
right
maybe I'm
isn't
wrong
even
about
like
that.
scary, like this is what was always so funny to me about the fascism debate. They're just like also doofuses. I mean, not to say that they don't have abhorrent ideas, but they're not like wielding political power in an incredibly scary or dangerous way. Biden was also awful on deportations, and the whole immigration deportation regime has been terrible under Democratic and Republican presidents. And so, like, I don't know what people I guess people had to feel like they had meaningful lives. As I argued in New Republic, it gave a drama to something that's not that dramatic. But yeah, so this is where we are.
I have been playing with the idea that part of this drama is about like justification for the status quo when competence can't really be appealed to by anybody.
Right.
So I mean, it does feel like since the Bush administration, which I know in a lot of people's mind has almost been erased from history,
Yeah.
we've been justifying everything based off of some crisis or another. But now it's just like everything is a crisis justification.
Yeah, that is as I argue in this Cold War liberalism piece that I was checking the footnotes of today. I think that's constitutive of modern liberal politics. So it's not a surprise that it's happened, and I think it will continue to happen. It's unfortunate, if predictable. Yeah, it's just a grim moment for politics, and like I said, kind of a boring one a little bit, at least from my macro perspective. It doesn't seem like much is going to change.
So you don't foresee Trump getting a resolution in the Ukraine-Russia war very quickly.
He might do that, but that was anyone who wasn't a true believer, like Blinken and Biden, would have made a similar choice. It just happened to be that you have these like strange guys who are like true believers in a project that no one really believes in and are themselves willing to totally deny it vis-a-vis Israel and Gaza. I think a sort of next issue Democrat would also not have done what Biden and Blinken did. Vis-a-vis Ukraine, just provided a blank check. I don't think Obama would have necessarily done that, for example. I actually think he probably wouldn't have done it, particularly in the second term. So that's not so like revolutionary to me, as opposed to actually it was strange that there was support for it, that there was. That's how I read that one.
Yeah, I have found the Biden administration to be, if not Clinton-esque, maybe even Scoop Jackson-esque in their
Yeah,
orientation. So
like old school, like Biden is so old. It's kind
yeah.
of a weird thing to still be.
Yeah, I guess I got my hopes up a little bit about his capitulations on Afghanistan, which Obama was not willing to do, but clearly the old school mentality has dominated this administration, and
Well,
Blinken's
Biden
been
was also
supporting.
always against Afghanistan, if I remember correctly. I
Mm-hmm.
think in like 2010, he was also against the
Mm-hmm.
surge. And so was Blinken. So that was kind of an outlier in the Biden world for whatever reason. But I mean, yeah, he was a pretty shitty president. He's going to go down as like, I think, a pretty bad one, like an all-time bad one.
Yeah,
Very
like
little he did was good. I mean, he seemed to be mentally infirm, so that's not a surprise. But yeah, pretty bad.
worse than Carter. Even speaking of Carter, since he died a couple of days before we are having this conversation, this will come out a couple months from now. Maybe we can assess Carter's legacy a little bit. How Carter has had, he took good stances on Israel early. I remember his apartheid book being super controversial in the aughts. But as an actual president, his foreign policy was pretty bad.
Yeah, I think the general take on Carter is not a great president, a pretty good post president in that he didn't just try to enrich himself like other post presidents. Um, but yeah, famously initiates the neoliberal turn. Obviously, there was something in the air. Probably a lot of people in that office would have done similarly. I don't think that was necessarily unique to Jimmy Carter. The response to the Iranian revolution was bad. The human rights thing fell away pretty quickly. Increasing turn to a type of neoliberal globalization focused economic policy. And Zbigniew Brzezinski being kind of aggressive with the Russians and the ending of détente, setting the stage for the Second Cold War of early Reagan. So yeah, I think that's probably how he'll pretty much be assessed. Yeah, though he was one of the small group of men in charge of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. So there's that.
Yeah, it's kind of hard not to be a little sketchy when you're the head of the Imperial Corps at
The
a
height.
time of height. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
it does seem like we are in. I also find foreign policy now to be both boring and also kind of bleak. For
Yep.
example, in Israel Palestine,
Yeah, very bleak.
I don't see a lot of ways that gets resolved. I mean,
It's being resolved right now, just in a
right.
terrible way, you know.
Well, let's rephrase that. And resolved in a way that I would feel good about.
Right.
Uh, and I think there was a lot of during 2022 and the beginning of 2020. I mean, in 2023, there's a lot of leftists who entertain things like that Hamas could win this, and I remember just
Who entertain? It was in a real way. I can't
I
imagine.
yes, but not. I wouldn't say people who actually know better, but yeah, there's
Yeah,
people who are arguing.
that's absurd.
Right.
That's just absurd. No honest analyst could possibly think that. Who was arguing that?
Some of the people around, say, Marxist Unity Group and the left of the DSA.
Okay, that's just whatever one's normative position. That was never in the offing. I don't think, from my opinion.
Well, what they seemed to think was that it would trigger a larger regional war, that the war that aggression in Lebanon would have happened earlier, and that Iran would have taken direct intervention. And
Okay,
in
none
no
of that's
world did
real.
I see
So
that. So
okay, so it's fantasy land. It's like people who say like China is going to lead the communist revolution. It's just like, no, why would you think that? There's zero evidence
right.
suggesting that to be the case. So I don't know. People
Yeah,
need to
it's
live in
not
their
like they've
fantasies.
reestablished a Comintern or anything.
Right.
um I was going to ask you, why do you think we live in a time? I mean, because this comes up in your Cold War liberalism article a little bit, but we live in a time of, frankly, more and more people taking political fantasies to kinds of strange conclusions. Why is that becoming more and more common?
Um,
Maybe it's not
um,
more and more common. Maybe it's always been bad, and I've just
I think that you see it more
Mhm.
because of the internet, but it'd be hard to measure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did in fact um people did retreat more into fantasy because again the future just appears closed off. I wouldn't be surprised if that is the case. um but it's unfortunate, but I just don't think we're headed down the path that we would otherwise like to be headed down. Nothing analytically suggests that to me.
um lately you've been talking a lot about people not recognizing the dangers of Cold War liberalism and the fact that it seems to still actually dominate a lot of political thinking. Why do you
Well,
think it's
I actually
good?
don't think it's dominant. I think that it
Okay.
was dominant during the World War on Terror. This is just more of an academic project. I think that like Cold War liberalism is a liberalism that believes in shit, and I think that we're actually at a different moment. We're at a more quote unquote realist moment. I'm publishing a book with Zero where you used to work on imperialist realism, so I finished that sort of essay of criticism, and I actually don't think Cold War liberalism is particularly influential right now. I think there's this sort of malaise feeling, this sort of foreclosure of the future when it comes to U.S. foreign relations and the imperial hegemon feeling, more so than there is a Cold War dominant view, which makes sense because the boomers are dying and getting old. So the Cold War just looms less and less as a force in American life, even though it loomed pretty large during the War on Terror because those boomers were the ones making the decisions. So I actually don't think it's that influential anymore,
Okay.
personally.
I tend to see it
It
as
endures. There's the rhetoric of it. Like Anne
right.
Applebaum is a Cold War liberal, but I don't think Anne Applebaum's particularly influential. Tim Snyder's a Cold War liberal and he sells a lot of books, but I don't think he's really shaping U.S. foreign policy. He just kind of comes off like silly when he, refers to Putin as Hitler and takes these wacky stances vis-a-vis Trump. I don't think most historians think especially highly of him. So it exists, it endures, but more as farce than tragedy.
Interestingly, I think the resistance mode of the first Trump administration seem to have given it a kind of false second or third or fourth life. I don't even know what to call it.
But it was not real, like they couldn't even stop Trump.
Right.
So like discursively it might have been important, but it wasn't like reflective of anything in real history.
Well, I think this leads to an important point, which is like don't confuse discourse with actual policy positions.
No, it doesn't matter. Yeah, discourse
Right.
doesn't matter. That's why Chomsky is wrong. I have a piece coming out about that. That will have been out by the time people listen to this. But yeah,
No.
I have that. Yeah.
Well, why do you think? In what ways do you think Chomsky is wrong? As a person who's published a lot of stuff against Chomsky recently, but go ahead.
I just think his emphasis on information politics is not the connection between information and politics is not correct fundamentally. So that's a lot of his writing. That's a lot of his contribution. Like he is correct insofar as it goes that, and this is important, particularly when he was writing, that the U.S. empire is like bad, and he's written a lot about that. But in terms of his analytical points, the point about change through mass politics is wrong. The point about information politics is wrong, and he's also wrong, I think, on the empirical claim that most people believe in what he terms in this latest book, The Myth of American Idealism. I don't think most people believe that anymore. They might have believed it in the 60s and 70s, but I don't think it. So I just think he's like represents what was correct in his moments is no longer correct.
Yeah. I mean, given his age, his moment was,
40 years ago, 50 years ago. Yeah.
Quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
I this does lead me to this kind of impasse where I wonder if the kind of boring drudgery of real politics is why so many people seem to be glomming on to political projections. I don't know if that. I mean, and it's hard to know if that wasn't true in the past because we just didn't know what that the average. We didn't have micro histories on the average person the way social media allows us to have now. So I just have no idea what people actually thought in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, but again, I wouldn't be surprised in a moment where there seems not that much political change is happening that people retreat into these types of, fantasy type areas.
I think particularly after, we can't accuse the Democrats lately of promising political change, but from 2008 to 2016 and then Trump as well have been promising something like an anti-status quo politics that has never really been.
Yeah, then this is the
quo.
Then this is the question, the mutual ruin question, right? Maybe that's where we're in, so it doesn't fucking matter that much, and I probably implicitly a lot of people are drawing that conclusion, if not intellectually, then emotionally, right? Why would you do this to yourself? I mean, I think you see you see it against it, like not only the turn against from quote unquote woke, but like people are angry at it now, and like I think that reflects sort of an anger at the feeling that nothing has changed. So you see like basically elite liberal institutions just like kicking out the DEI officers and things like that. And I think that just reflects a total turn away from politics in general.
So, do you think we're in a depolitical moment in the way like a lot of people thought the late 70s and early 80s were? Or
well, I think it's an important part of people's identities. But I mean, it does seem like there's probably going to be less mass interest in it, would be my guess, than there has been.
What reason do you, I mean, I have my theories on this, but what reason do you think politics as an ideal set, not politics as something that you actually fucking do, is so much a part of people's identities right now?
Because they're alienated and intellectualized, and they associate with ideology because they lack organic connections to people in their community. Probably something like that. And then like you have various capitalist incentives that make it, remunerative to stoke people's anxieties and fears, and that's also going to encourage association with politics because it seems like that's the only way to change it. So probably something like that would be my guess.
Well, to me, one of the weirdest things that I still hear, even in mainstream discourse, and I want to say that it's primarily discourse, I don't see a lot of evidence that people actually care on a policy level, is concerned about quote unquote Christian nationalism. And when I look at like the rates of religiosity amongst young people, I don't know what they're scared of. But maybe, you know,
in terms of what, that people are becoming less religious.
Well, no, in terms of like there's a massive Christian nationalist movement that will have support amongst the young, because I just don't see, like, even if you see more people going to church like this week or whatever, you're the decline in religiosity between generations is fairly huge.
Yeah, I don't think that's a real worry. Again, that's like the fascism shit. The same people who worry about Christian nationalists are the same people who are worried about fascism. You know, it's just stoking fears of an organic 20th century enemy that doesn't really exist, and your life is still meaningless, no matter how many blog posts you write.
I mean, in some ways, it's stuff that we've seen before. I remember in the Bush administration talk about dominionist, and me going, George W. Bush is not a dominionist. That's a ridiculous claim.
It's sort of like secular liberal societies' anxieties about like religion and belief coming to the fore. So yeah, it's predictable.
I do have, I mean, one of the questions I have thought a lot about is like the quote unquote socialist left. Given that, you know, I'm a weirdo sectarian and I know that, but I also know my opinions are like not broadly shared amongst the American public, and I have no delusions about that. I have thought a lot about this so-called popularity of socialism amongst millennials, which has always struck me as an overstated thing, and also the Pew polls don't indicate that it actually lasted very long. But there's been some talk about, you know, Gen Z having a lot of weird, incoherent politics that people are now interested in. And I guess my question about this is like, well, there might be people who get quote radicalized by movements online or whatever, but so far I don't see how that's affected anything in American political life.
No, it doesn't. There's no party, so there's no ideological discipline. So it's not a surprise that people have ideologies that are all over the place. There's no institutional structure to enforce or even teach ideology. So yeah, people are gonna have weird ideologies because there's no institution. You know, right. It's obvious. You know,
and you don't think there's any way to have a party in the United States anytime real soon that's not one of the major two, correct?
I mean, no. There's nothing in history that suggests there is. Yeah, it's kind of hopeless.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I've really thought about this is just like people talking honestly about the structure of the Constitution and then their proposals for fixing that. It's like abolish the Senate, but then I'm always like, don't you have to control, I don't know, like 40 states to even talk about doing that?
Yeah,
like,
that's literally saying like have God come down and tell you to be good. It is in the realm of pure fantasy. Abolish the Senate. It's meaningless. It's a meaningless thing to say. With no connection to power or change or anything. And then the left says organize, which is also meaningless given the deterioration of social relations. So yeah, there we are. Here we are.
Well, when the left says organize, I've always been confused about that word. To me seems like almost empty at this point when I ask people what they mean by it, because I'm like, well,
in theory, it'd mean like organize your industrial union, but they're like the social relations of that sort of organization and building a power base based on the working class don't exist due to the deterioration of the American economy into basically an economy of freelancers with no protection. So like it doesn't, the question isn't organized. The question first should be like, how would one organize in a dislocated and alienated economy? And we don't know that.
Right. I mean, it is interesting because that was like when Marx was writing, that was the case of a lot of the proletariat, but that's not the high point of the workers' movement. The high point of the workers' movement is during industrialization, where it's easy to organize people because there's lots of people in one place. Like,
yeah, and also like in actual fact, it was helped in this country at least by like defense production.
Mm-hmm.
So it was always connected also to the empire, particularly after World War II. So there's a lot of contradictions there as well. But yeah, I mean, it's this is the situation in which we find ourselves.
And what do you think about a lot of the attempts to bring quote Fordism back, since it does look like neoliberalism, whatever the fuck that means to people? And I have my definition of it, but it's not what a lot of people mean by it. Seems to be on its stagnation period. Do you see any hope in that?
No. Why would there be a reshoring of a manufacturing economy? Right now, I think it's about 8 or 9% of the American workforce works in manufacturing. So we've also lost a lot of the institutional knowledge to, for example, like build a factory and make it work. That doesn't just exist in the world. You actually have people who know how to do that. We don't really know how to do that any longer. And also, I just think with a lot of technological change that a lot of this stuff is going to be automated out of existence as it already was. Plus, given actually existing capitalism, people are going to do arbitrage and pay lower labor costs. So if there's no political transformation, why would we see the type of reshoring of American manufacturing? But not only that, even if there was a political transformation, would we really want to reshore manufacturing labor? Wouldn't the idea be to move past it, to basically do the Marxist dream as a critic in the morning, blah, 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 blah? I mean, it's not like these jobs are goods in and of themselves. You'd want to have different types of human emancipation. So I don't understand the fetishization of manufacturing work. It just seems, again, like very 20th century, and the moment is not that one.
Yeah, it seems to me mostly to be nostalgia from people who don't know manufacturing work. I mean, it's when I talk about it a lot, I'm just always like, yeah, it's 8 to 13% of the population has any job related to it. And the organic composition, usually like a technical term, you don't need the same amount of people to do the work, and that theoretically is a good thing. Like you know, now in practice, I get that it's kind of a problem under current conditions, but that's not just true in the United States, though. And I think this is often missed by like third worldists and whatnot. It's true everywhere. I mean, the urbanization of say Latin America, Southeast Asia, that doesn't have a corresponding industrialization does seem to like throw a lot of classical Marxist tactics and strategy just totally for a loop, and not just here. And I think that's often ignored.
Yeah, as one would expect, because history is dynamically changing. So the problem is just the power of whoever we want to identify as the workers or the Marxists just pales in comparison to the actual power of the capitalist state, or the capitalist order, or the imperial state, however you want to frame it. Whatever it is, we don't have the power. So Bernie Sanders was kind of like an end run about that. It was kind of a Hail Mary pass to at least get the boots off the neck of people, but that failed. So yeah, it's tough to know where to go.
And so you think that the financialization of various industries will probably continue unabated?
Why wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons why I think you're right is actually I am somewhat of a classical Marxist, and when I point out that like actual commodity production isn't super profitable right now, like
no, it's all fake. I mean, the falling rate of profit thing is real. Like, obviously, capital is not going to be able to get the return in the 21st century than capital is able to get, for example, building the American West. Like that is just not going to pay. I mean, it's already been done. That frontier has been closed, so you just get the fucking fake capital with these gigantic market capitalizations of 5 monopolistic companies. It's not a healthy capitalism, which is why it does lead to things like climate change and self-implosion and self-destruction. And that may be where we're going. I don't think capitalism is healthy. It's obviously a kind of cancerous rot, but there's nothing else to cure it. So here we are.
Right. And a lot of people are putting their faith that other countries will be able to break out of this cycle, but do you see
there's nothing that suggests that? No, what would suggest that? What's the evidence?
Well, a lot of projections on the China, but I don't see any of that panning out, particularly with their youth unemployed. Magic. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
like, it's not real. Like, I mean, do you think I mean, also China's just going to have to confront the fact that so much of its legitimacy is based on consumption, and consumption is, just in opposition to the earth. And so that's going to also be like a huge tension that's not going to be able to be resolved, which is true of all actual societies, that the political legitimacy now rests on consumption, which is a big fucking problem, because the thing you need to reduce to actually address climate is the thing that is impossible to reduce, because no one in power can do it. So it's in a pretty bad situation.
Yeah, particularly if you have to derive a profit, because as I've
yes
pointed out,
in capitalism,
right, yeah, because you can
because of
produce stuff
yeah.
that lasts for a long time, but we don't do that.
No, because you need to constantly get more money and increase profits, growth of quarter to quarter. It's pretty sick.
So, I mean, it's just, I think maybe there's some hope in the ecological society claims of China, and then projections on
Yeah,
Xi.
China could
But
do that. Maybe they could do like EVs and stuff. It does seem like they're making genuine pushes in that direction, but it's still under the capitalist framework ultimately, in a capitalist world dominated by the United States. So even if China were to surpass the United States, it would have to be like really drastic transformations in technology. And to me, that just seems like the other side of the coin of libertarians who say, yeah, technology will solve it. Don't worry about climate. It seems similarly in the realm of fantasy.
It's also interesting to me that very few people on the left talk about like youth unemployment in China, and also a coming demographic crisis, which will fix the youth unemployment eventually, but
Yeah,
that'll have a cost.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't seem to me that there's really enough evidence to suggest that like something real is in the offing. A genuine transformation is in the offing with China. Not yet. Things could change, but I don't see it.
I've never asked you about this, but I've wondered about what you've made of the idea that BRICS is not a socialist order, because I mean that would be ridiculous, and people who think that, but as an alternative capitalist order, is viable or not.
I mean, I do think that in terms of alternative order, no, but I do think that it could assert authority that pushes the United States a little bit off their backs, and that's a good thing. I think American relative power is in decline, even though the United States is overwhelmingly powerful. You have to have those two thoughts in our head at the same time. And so I don't think that the BRICS is going to engender a new global order, but it could on the margins, and maybe over time less on the margins, force the United States out of particular regions. For example, I don't think the US is going to be in East Asia in 20 years in the way that it's been since World War II. Right. Probably be in Latin America pretty significantly, and it seems like in the Middle East also, but probably not in East Asia, and that's a genuine change.
Do we see France getting pushed more out of Africa?
I don't know enough about it, but sure, okay. France is relatively weakening, so yeah, I'll say yes.
It does seem like when people talk about decline, there was a lot of people who did not see Europe as declining far quicker than the United States in relative power.
But it is,
yeah, and I don't know why they didn't see it. Like,
it seems obvious a little bit. Yeah, like all the juice moved from Europe to the US a long time ago. So yeah, I thought that was, I didn't know how quick, but it did happen pretty quickly.
I mean, it took one energy shock around a war that, I mean, it's a significant war. I don't want to claim it's insignificant, but you would think the entire European infrastructure would not be so dependent on Russian gas, but I was wrong about that. So
yeah, they are, and it is important, and it demonstrated the importance of particular regions of the world to the international economy, and that's still true.
One of the things that I have been thinking a lot about is there was a lot of misprojection in circles like the gray zone about what was going to happen in Syria. Now, I'm not, I'm not one of these people who celebrates a former Al Qaeda aligned government in Syria, but I also don't understand why people were pretending that somehow this would lead to new chaos, as if there wasn't chaos in Syria already.
Yeah, these seems like it's funny. I mean, it just doesn't come across my transom. This
Okay.
seems like pretty small left-wing groups, right? It sounds like.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how. One, I don't know. I don't always know if I would classify gray zone as consistently left wing, but like,
Oh yeah,
are they
not
small?
even talking about the gray zone. Yeah. I mean, I guess there's just such a disconnect from policy. So it
Hmm.
really just takes place so in the realm of discourse, that you kind of doing Dungeons and Dragons campaigns at some point, which actually makes it less interesting from my own end, not to talk about anyone else, to write about foreign policy, because it does seem like there's so little room for change, and that there has been so little change in so long.
Um, do we? One thing I have wondered is, are we going to see changes in the pivot to Asia at all?
I mean, they're going
Because
to try
that's
to
been
do
like
it,
a.
but China's just too powerful. So I think it's a
Mhm.
failed project. There's no way they're going to be able to successfully maintain the type of hegemony that they apparently want to maintain. It's just a matter of time. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of money filtered into that, and a lot of people trying to claim that things will be different. But I just think that they're fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's interesting to me is that's an area where a lot of people perceive that that was a change under Trump, but that's really a long-standing
Yeah,
change.
it goes back to Obama. Yeah,
Yeah,
if not, I
and
mean,
really,
earlier people. Yeah,
I was reading Samuel Huntington and like realizing, oh, this was this. Some people wanted this all the way back in like the early '80s. It's just,
yeah, of course. Yeah, people have been arguing that China is coming around the corner, as it were.
um, it's. I mean, to me, it's like, well, it's already China's already a major power. We already live in a quote unquote multipolar world. Not that the people throw that around. I necessarily agree with what they mean by it, but I think it is a fact that we have. The U.S. is the most powerful amongst increasingly regional powers, and I think U.S. policymakers seem to know that. But what do you make about that? Are they still trying to be expansionist? I can't tell.
China?
No, the United States. So, like, are we trading? Are we like walling ourselves off finally, or for our
No.
imperial power, or are we
No, no, no,
trying to
no, no, no,
expand?
no. Well, first of all, we never rolled ourselves off. We always dominated the Western Hemisphere. So even the quote unquote walling off is just dominating the entirety of Latin America and parts of the Pacific.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
but yeah, as you know. But no, I just think that there's going to be a relative retreat over time from East Asia because China's too powerful. Like, it's that simple. China's too powerful and Eastern Europe isn't important enough. So there's probably going to be a retreat from Eastern Europe, a retreat from East Asia, and probably also over time the Middle East. That's what the United States, I think, really wants. There and the fact that the Israelis are quote unquote solving the issue of Palestine is going to be in American policymakers' perceived interest, because Israel's just going to normalize with the big Arab states, and that'll be that. And then the U.S. can retreat from the Middle East, and it has a permanent bastion there. So I could see all those are things that I could definitely see happening.
Um, what do you make around? I mean, one of the things about Syria was that it was seen as a loss for the axis of resistance, which even people like Rashid Khalidi said was just basically an Iranian interest project. Uh, what does this mean for Iran if America starts to pull out of the region? Is it going to?
I mean, Iran seems pretty weak, all
Mhm.
told. And I mean, I'm not sure how strong Saudi is, but it does seem stronger than Iran. And the US is backing it. I mean, I think just basically Hezbollah and Iran and Hamas have just been proven to be pretty weak since October 7th, in Lebanon, generally speaking. So I think that is just the accurate situation on the ground there, is that Israel and the US and the US allies are more powerful.
Right. I mean, and do we see like the conflict of interest between like say Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar more dominating the issue? Because I do think there's a kind of misunderstanding that I think comes out of ironically the Bush years, where people realize there's a difference between Sunni and Shia to see the Sunni world as unified in a way that it isn't.
No, of course
Um,
not. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is all like post Ottoman decline. well, not Ottoman in the case of Iran, but generally speaking, like the formation of a new order a century after like an order that ruled it for 5 centuries came apart. So things are still kind of shaking out, I think, in this moment of the nation state and post-colonial not resistance, post-colonial national movements. And so I think it's still shaking out in effect.
So do you think we're still seeing national consolidation in the Middle East, or?
Tough to know. I mean, like obviously the nation state was like really in a position in the Middle East. It was in a position basically everywhere outside of Western and Central Europe, but it was really in a position in the Middle East. So we'll see what actually happens over time. It's difficult to know.
Right. So foreign policy is boring and kind of bleak and bloody. All right. I guess one question, if we're in a realist moment, and I think we are, where are the divisions between realists right now? I mean, because, I used to sometimes think, okay, this may be too discourse driven, but I would read like Peter Zion versus John Mearsheimer for like what liberal or democratic aligned realist thought versus what more paleo-conservative-esque realists think, like Mearsheimer. But are there divisions between realists? Are they relatively unified right now? And if there are divisions, what
Well,
are they?
Mearsheimer wants the U.S. to dominate China, which seems to me um, totally impossible. So I think like that's not realist at all. So I guess that's a big division on the degree to which not only the United States normatively should, but empirically can confront China, which, as you imagine, I think is ridiculous. Obviously, the United States is not going to be able to remain dominant in East Asia. It's fucking China. It's gigantic and mega powerful. What are you talking about? Seems so obvious, but Mearsheimer is under the delusion that the United States is going to be able to remain regionally hegemonic in East Asia, which just seems absurd to me.
Yeah. I think it's kind of crazy too, and particularly also if India's economy is doing well these days. I mean, it's still nowhere near relatively as powerful as China, but like there's just that's an area where there's not just one but like several major powers that are fairly significant.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So that's probably the biggest division. But then I would say Mearsheimer is just like an American hegemonist, at least in part. So it's not especially a surprise, but I guess that's a division. I think like some people get annoyed with like my position at least because it seems hopeless. But to me, like it's just there's no reason in painting what I consider to be a false picture, but that's not so much disagreement as just like wanting to emphasize a different area, I guess. So, yeah, I guess I'm not sure there's that many divisions between quote unquote realists in my opinion. I don't know if you see anything that I haven't.
I don't know. I mean, this is your area of specialty. I do kind of think there's a difference in age, and one of the things I was thinking about Mearsheimer is just that he's older.
Yes, he is.
And Zion is pretty blunt about like the way he wants to handle China, which is not dominance. He seems to be blowing smoke over people's asses that the demographic crisis is just going to fix the problem for the United States. And as long as we leave them alone and kind of pull back from the region and then focus on Russia, I guess, then the issue
I just don't know how
itself.
I don't know how anyone. I mean, the U.S. was in a unique position after World War II, also after 1949, but really after World War II, it's not going to be able to maintain dominance. It's crazy, totally fantasy land. So yeah, I almost like don't even pay attention to these debates because they're so obvious. Like, you think in fucking 15 years the U.S. is going to be dominant in East Asia? Like, obviously not. So what are we even talking about?
Right.
I wrote about this in Harper's a few years ago, and my position hasn't changed. The U.S. is in regional decline there, obviously, and it will continue to be in regional decline there, obviously.
I do think we have to admit, in terms of world power, the United States, it has declined, but a lot of people seem to think that a relative decline is somehow an absolute decline, and the United States is no longer
It's
a major
not.
player.
the United States is still the major player in international affairs. It's just not the only major player. Uh, Even though it's still primus inter pares in an Augustinian sense,
Hmm.
in terms of Augustus, but it's not what it was in 45 or 89. Um, so you have to hold those thoughts in one's head at the same time.
Why do you think it's so hard for people to do that? Because I will say a lot of people, not just leftists, seem to think that the US is in some sort of absolute decline. And I'm like, are you looking at the same stats that I'm looking at? But yeah, I guess
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is not as powerful as it once was, but it's still extremely powerful, extremely powerful.
right.
And so yeah, I don't think the empire is like kind of going away anytime soon. Uh, Even if it's not going to remain dominant in East Asia. My basic take on it.
Do you think that's because people confuse the relative incompetence of like cultural and political elites for the incompetence of
I think people
policy?
lack meaning. I think people lack meaning. And I
Okay.
think that there is a genuine crisis of meaning in an alienated capitalist society. Like Marx was correct. Obviously, when social bonds are weakened, when you're alienated, even in experience of like a mass culture or mass politics as existed in the 20th century, we're more and more alienated over time. And so that is going to just necessarily lead to people placing faith in more fantastical elements not connected to reality or fantastical stories not connected to reality. I think that's basically the long and short of it. Most people also aren't trained to be like hardcore analysts. I mean, especially when you're talking about younger people, particular things have been closed off to them, like family and advancing in a career and other ways of finding meaning that it did exist previously in history. And so they get interested in more and more abstract things like political ideology. And I think a lot of it emerges from that.
Well, this is going to lead me to ask you one of the few domestic questions I was going to ask you about, which is
Sure.
the decline of the university, which I think is both. I know people who try to get me to talk about like, oh, why don't you tell people to go into the trades all the time? And I'm like, because I know
Dude,
what the out.
this is so funny. These worlds that you are bumping up against. I want to get
Mhm.
people to go into the trades. So you want like basically a society of artisans? I guess
Right.
that would be nice. Just everyone's in art, like doing woodwork in their shack that they built. It's just not how the economy has functioned for literally hundreds of years.
Well, this is a
That's
funny
so funny.
thing because I get it. I've started to get it from leftists, but I've got it from right wingers here in Utah, like for
Which
years.
is a fantasy nostalgia, right? That's just a
Right.
classic, like men working with their hands type shit.
The funny thing about that to me is that on one hand, I do think like yes, American universities are in decline. And I wanted to ask you about that because there seems to be denial that, for example, one of the reasons the humanities is in decline is that they've lost their mission, and part of the reason why they've lost their mission is they've kind of been I don't know. I kind of view like universities the way I view the Southern Baptist Convention is to the GOP. The universities humanities departments are to the Democratic Party, which is now kind of like a declining subsidiary to it. But I wanted your take on that. Um,
Well, I mean, historically, the humanities were in the 19th century connected to nationalism. Same in the
mm,
20th century, connected to like nationalist ideals of liberal and progressive development. After World War II, became connected to the American Imperial project, and then became more critical of it. It's kind of where after the 60s rights movements, they kind of retreated into the academy, and over time, I think that turns out disconnecting the humanities from larger small c conservative cultural projects is not good for the long-term benefit of the humanities. Also, we're an increasingly secularized, STEM focused, pragmatic focused society, even though obviously American pragmatism's core feature of American culture. But that has now been transmuted into the purpose of an education is to get you a job Also, this is, of course, affected by capitalism, and universities under capitalism tends, obviously, as we've seen, in empirical historical reality, to become geared towards not a literal trade in the artisanal sense, the idea that a degree is basically an audition for a job, and the humanities were never going to thrive in that environment. So I think that all of those concatenation of factors have come together to basically lead to the decline of the humanities, and the effective end of the middle class dream of the 20th century university was that even if, son of a machine worker, or son of a plumber, or daughter of a housewife, or daughter of a house aide, was able to become a PhD in history and lead a good, solid life in life of arts and letters, unlike any other time in history. And I think that's true, and that's kind of coming to an end. So this is actually already over.
Yeah, I mean, I saw. I was watching a debate around the decline of men going into universities, and there was like, oh, it's male flight equivalent to white flight. I'm like, well, white flight's a complicated phenomenon that's partly about economic pricing. But not to say that it isn't real, it absolutely is. But when I was looking at the male flight argument, I'm like, well, what's the economic benefit from not going to college? I guess you don't get saddled with debt. But if you look at
you basically need to go to college to become a middle class person,
right.
So you still need to do it. It's just the sort of benefit of it is less than it's been because more people are doing it. So yeah, I mean, there's also a gigantic problem in white collar work. I think AI is going to wipe out a lot of white collar work. The automation that hit the blue collar workers starting in the 40s is now coming for quote unquote creative intellectual work. Turns out that a lot of that is going to be rote and craft. So there's going to be a genuine crisis of that as well. So that's also coming for all the Marxists that think China is the vanguard of the revolution.
Well, AI is interesting to me because it's both less good at some of that than you think, but it's very good at a lot of rote stuff, and I think people underestimate the rote.
It's going to be extremely good at rote stuff, and a lot of this is David Graeber's bullshit jobs thing, right? It was Graeber, right? And so like it's going to be able to replace those jobs. And basically capital needs to reduce labor costs, and there is no blue collar workforce, so they're going to have to go to the white collar workforce. So ideally, this again, AI should be a good thing as long as it didn't destroy the environment. You don't want to do those drudgery bullshit jobs. You want to be free to compose in the morning and criticize in the afternoon and do blah blah blah, build your woodworking facility. But again, this is capitalism, so basically it's just going to be more of the same, I think.
Yeah, that's my bleaker view too, is even though it's not going to replace a lot of like high creativity stuff, there's a whole...
It can't do that. Yeah. I mean, it can't do that. It's what it's going to reduce is basically the capitalist class. This is coming for essentially the PMC and capitalists. It's not going to come from like high level screenwriters or novelists or writers, even though I'm sure AI could do something in the style of me. It won't ever be as good, won't ever have the insight that a new thing will have. But it turns out like a lot of the shit is rote and craft and could able to be learned on the capital side. So I think this one is primarily, it's kind of ironic that the left is anti it because it's coming from the capitalists. The left base has already been destroyed. It's coming for the capital side of the equation. It's eating itself, right? It's eating the capitalist side as one might have expected already.
I guess it's coming for coders too, but it's
it's coming for low-level coders, and I think like so people learning to code, like Obama told them, it's not going to be great for them.
Which, I mean, part of my thing is we were talking about it in terms of music, and someone's like, "Well, I like a lot of generic music," and I was like, "Well, music has been made generic by capital for a while, partly because of the way that it's served up to people through streaming services and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's still interesting music out there. It's not, I don't want to say like there's not, but for the most part, like I can, like if you like country pop, I know exactly what that's going to be. And an AI probably can do that.
Right.
So like,
I think, I mean, again, the problem isn't in the AI. The problem is in the society within the AI exists. Automation is a good thing. AI is a good thing, in theory. The problem is that under capitalism, it is geared towards reducing labor and making money. So you can, but like, it's going to be hard. I think it's going to be hard for the left to get like too upset about the capitalist jobs that AI gets rid of. It's going to get rid of like middle management, which is that a productive class? I don't know. I'm not shedding too many tears.
Yeah, I was talking to someone. They're like, "Are you afraid it's going to take teachers' jobs?" And I'm like, "They're going to try, but just like when they
it's not
tried
going to work
with the massive
with the
online
MOOCs. Yeah.
classes, it's not going to work. Like the
No, it's
MOOCs
not going to work.
failed
It's
too.
going to be able to get rid of rote craft stuff, that stuff that could like genuinely be learned. So yeah, I mean, that's happening. That's going to happen.
It's also
It's the first real investment. Like capital was flailing around with NFTs. It was flailing around with crypto. AI is actually going to redound to some benefit. Again, not the benefit, the sort of return of settling the American West, but a genuine return due to reduction of work.
Yeah, with the caveat is they need to make its energy costs go way down, and they haven't yet. But
yeah, they're going to really need to do that. Actually, like that's actually pretty important. I think. I also think a lot of people are already using AI. Like I think a lot of I think it's being amalgamated as a tool into places. So, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if we started talking about fact checking. AI is probably a pretty good fact checker. That's something it could probably be pretty good at. With training over time. And I wouldn't be surprised if all magazines from left to right start using AI to do things like fact checking as opposed to having no fact checker. So you could see where it's going to start affecting things.
It's a pretty good copy editor too, as much as I hate to admit it.
Yeah. I mean, this is the rote sort of stuff that a human brain misses that a large language model is not going to miss because it's not a human brain.
Right.
It's never going to produce Romeo and Juliet, but it could tell you what year Romeo and Juliet was published.
Yeah, I do think that means that the humanities don't burge well. Although I have taken some hope that actually, like, okay, well, maybe the humanities will get the fuck out of the academy a little bit because I mean, basically, that's
just
what I
for
do.
rich people.
Unfortunately, yeah, or rich people are people that can con rich people into giving them money.
Yeah, which is such a just begging people to give me money. No, gracias.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a podcaster. I can't say much about that, but
no, I also beg people for money. Don't get me wrong, but it is what it is.
it's I could make all my living from it. I'll tell you that would be really hard and really degrading. But I guess I guess that's where a lot of the response to you comes from, is that people feel like you're hopeless. And I've had Benjamin Studebaker on a lot to talk about domestic stuff that people feel are similarly hopeless. And, I guess for me,
I don't know, things might be hopeless.
Yeah, for me, sometimes when someone's like, well, don't you have a solution? And I'm like, well, maybe there isn't one right now. Like,
right. I mean, there clearly isn't one. I think that's pretty obvious. I think.
Right. Yeah. Well, on that note,
well, it's a pleasure. Everyone subscribe to American Prestige. That's the only thing that will ensure social progress, is if you pay me and Varn to podcast and bring these hot takes directly to your dome as you do laundry, the dishes, or drive.
Right.
Or walk if you're in a walkable area. You might be walking right now.
Where is
we do some ASMR.
Where's American Prestige at these days?
Supporting cast. We've moved around. We've bounced around, but we left Substack and we're at supporting cast now.
Supporting cast, okay. So go find it on supporting cast and
support our cast.
Right. All right.
Thank you so
much.
Bye.